Letters never read, promises never kept, and the city that changed while she was gone. A story of returning, remembering, and finally letting go. The city of Seoul seemed frozen in a moment of twilight, where the sun's dying light met the first stirrings of the evening. From her apartment balcony, Jiwon could see the sprawling expanse of the city beneath her. The buildings were tall, their sharp edges contrasting against the soft blur of the sky, now painted in hues of lavender and blue. The lights of the city flickered on, scattered across the horizon like stars, hidden in a world too full of noise to notice them. The scene, though beautiful, felt distant. The city was alive, yet it seemed to exist far from her reach, untouchable and indifferent to the presence of one small woman in its midst. Jiwon stood there, still, for a long time, her gaze fixed on the urban landscape that stretched beyond the glass. The air was cool, brushing her skin lightly, but it offered no comfort. She had moved back to Seoul 2 months ago, telling herself it was time to return, to find closure, to start over. But no matter how many times she told herself she had come to escape, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was merely existing here. The apartment was hers, but it didn't belong to her in the way she had imagined. It was just a space, neatly furnished, perfectly arranged, but hollow. It held none of the warmth she had hoped for, none of the connection to her past, and no true sense of belonging. Her fingers curled slightly around the cold metal of the railing, the surface smooth and impersonal beneath her touch. In the 2 months since her return, she had made an effort to settle in, to fill the empty corners of her life with things she thought might help her move on. She had filled the apartment with a mixture of modern furniture and personal items, pictures from her travels, a few of her favorite books, and plants that she had carefully selected, thinking they would add a touch of life to the space. But even with all of these efforts, the emptiness persisted. It was as if the very act of trying to create a home only made her more aware of how far she was from the person she had once been. Turning away from the balcony, Jiwon moved into the living room, her eyes flicking briefly over the familiar but foreign space. Her gaze landed on the small coffee table, where a stack of old letters lay. They were crumpled slightly at the edges, a sign of the years they had spent in her possession. They were from him. The man who had once been her entire world, or at least that was how she had imagined it. The words on those pages, written in a delicate, almost unfamiliar script, had once carried the weight of her hopes. She had saved them all these years, never daring to read them, never willing to confront the ghosts of the past that they represented. They were promises. They were memories. Things she couldn't bear to face. She hadn't opened them since the day she had left. Not once. She had kept them, preserved them like fragile artifacts of a time she had hoped to forget. But the truth was, those letters were all she had left of him. The only tangible thing remaining from the life they had shared together, the life that had been interrupted, was left hanging like an unfinished story. Jiwon had promised herself that one day she would read them. She had told herself that one day, when she was ready, when enough time had passed, she would open those letters and find some kind of closure. But that day had never come. She couldn't bring herself to open them. Not yet. Maybe never. Her fingers hovered over the stack for a moment, before she pushed them aside, moving quickly as if to forget about them once again. She wasn't ready to confront the past. Not now. The silence of the apartment pressed against her, a heavy weight she couldn't shake. She needed to escape, to get out into the world and forget for a while. She needed to remind herself that life went on, that there was more to her existence than the quiet confines of her thoughts. Jiwon grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped outside. The cool air greeted her like an old friend, its crispness filling her lungs and momentarily pushing away the heavy thoughts that seemed to cling to her mind. The streets of Seoul stretched out before her, familiar and yet unfamiliar. In the time she had been away, the city had changed. People walked quickly down the streets, their faces blank, absorbed in their own thoughts. The hum of traffic, the soft murmur of voices, the constant shuffle of feet, they were all part of the rhythm of the city, a rhythm she had once been so in tune with, but now felt disconnected from. She didn't have a destination in mind. She never did when she walked like this. She simply let her feet carry her through the maze of streets, following paths she had taken countless times before. But the more she walked, the more she realized that those familiar streets no longer held any meaning for her. Places she had once enjoyed, places where she had spent hours with friends, laughing and chatting, now felt like distant memories, disconnected from the person she had become. Jiwon passed a cafe she used to frequent. The soft light spilling from the windows and the smell of coffee brought a flood of memories. She had sat there many times, reading or writing, letting the world pass by as she lost herself in her thoughts. But now, the cafe seemed distant. The laughter that had once filled the space felt like a sound from another life. She didn't belong there anymore. She didn't belong anywhere. Her feet continued to carry her, her mind lost in the rhythm of her steps, until she found herself standing at the edge of the Han River. She hadn't planned on coming here, but it felt right. The river had always been a place of quiet reflection for her, a place where she could sit and watch the water move, listening to the soft murmur of the current, losing herself in its flow. It had been her escape when things became too overwhelming, her retreat from a world that sometimes felt too noisy, too demanding. Jiwan sat on a bench by the water, her coat drawn tight around her as the cold night air pressed against her skin. The river before her was still, the water reflecting the distant city lights. It was as if the entire world had been muted, softened, blurred by the night. The sound of the city was faint here, lost in the space between the river's edge and the dark sky above. The only sound that reached her was the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind, a sound that felt like a sigh from the earth itself. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness settle around her. She had come here often in the past when the weight of her life became too much to carry alone. The river had always offered some sense of peace, some quiet refuge from the chaos. But tonight, it felt different. The water, dark and reflective, seemed to mirror her thoughts. It flowed steadily, endlessly, as if time itself could not stop, as if the past and present were one and the same. Jiwan reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. It was old, the edges frayed from years of being folded and unfolded, and as her fingers brushed over it, she felt the weight of its significance. It had been so long since she had read it. She had carried it with her all this time, believing that one day the words on this page would provide the answers she sought. I will always wait for you. No matter how long it takes, no matter where you go, I will wait for you. The words were familiar, almost too familiar. They had once meant everything to her. They had been the promise that had kept her going, the anchor in the storm. But time had passed. Years had passed. The promise had been stretched thin, strained by the distance and the silence that had come to define their relationship. The weight of those words had changed. What once felt like a lifeline now seemed like an echo, a ghost of something that had never truly been real. She folded the paper carefully, slipping it back into her coat pocket. The promise had been made, but it had been broken. Not by actions or words, but by the quiet passing of time, by the things left unsaid. Jiwan stood up from the bench, her legs stiff from sitting too long, and began to walk along the river, her steps slow and deliberate. The city's lights gleamed ahead, but they no longer seemed inviting. They no longer seemed to offer any answers, no matter how desperately she had once hoped for them to do so. She had come back to Seoul hoping for closure, hoping that time would heal the wounds of the past. But now, she understood. Closure was something you had to create for yourself. The past was gone, and the future was uncertain. All she had was the present, the quiet echo of her own unspoken thoughts, and the steady rhythm of the river that moved on, whether she was ready or not. The days in Seoul bled together for Jiwan, each one indistinguishable from the next. She had spent the last few weeks trying to find a rhythm, trying to understand the city again, but nothing felt the same. The place she had once called home now seemed distant, like an old dream that she could no longer recall in detail. There was nothing familiar about the streets, no comfort in the sounds of the bustling crowds or the quiet hum of the subway. It all felt foreign. And with each passing day, Jiwan realized just how much she had changed during the years she had been away. Despite her efforts to adjust, the weight of the past lingered. Every time she walked through the city, memories of him, of them, flooded her thoughts. The places they had once visited together, the coffee shops where they had shared quiet moments, the parks where they had spent afternoons lost in conversation, they all felt like ghosts, hovering around her, reminding her of what had been lost. She had returned to Seoul hoping to reconnect with something, but she had found nothing but emptiness. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Jiwan found herself walking down the familiar streets once more, her footsteps slow and deliberate. She didn't know why she had come this way, why she had let her feet guide her down these narrow lanes. Maybe she was searching for something, some trace of the past, some sign that it hadn't all been a dream. Or maybe she was simply trying to forget, to lose herself in the city she had once known. Her path led her to a small alley, tucked away between two high-rise buildings. She remembered this place, a quiet spot where they had once spent hours talking about nothing and everything. It was here, in this corner of the city, where she had first fallen in love with him. It had been a secret place, hidden from the world, where they could be themselves without fear of being seen. The memories flooded her all at once, so vivid and so sharp that they almost hurt. The way he had looked at her then, the softness in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, it all seemed so far away now. Jiwon stood there, in the alley, feeling the cool evening breeze brush against her skin. She could almost hear his voice, as if he were standing next to her, speaking the words he had once whispered into her ear. "I will wait for you, no matter how long it takes, no matter where you go." The words had been a promise, a bond that she had held on to for so long. But now they seemed like a lie, a fragile illusion built on hope and wishful thinking. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that everything she had believed in was slipping through her fingers. The promise had been made, but time had passed, and the distance between them had only grown. The love that once felt like a solid foundation was now nothing more than a memory, a fleeting moment in the vast expanse of time. With a heavy heart, Jiwon turned and began walking again, her pace quickening as she left the alley behind. She didn't want to face the reality of what she had lost, but it was impossible to ignore. The city had changed, but so had she. The person she had been when she left had disappeared, replaced by someone who no longer recognized herself. She had come back to Seoul with the hope of finding closure, of finding some way to heal the wounds of the past. But as the days passed, she realized that closure was an illusion, a word that held no real meaning. The past didn't fade, it lingered, like a shadow, a presence that refused to be shaken. Her footsteps led her to the river once again. The Han River, flowing endlessly through the heart of the city, had always been a place of solitude for her. She had come here countless times in the past, sitting by the water, listening to the gentle murmur of the current, finding some semblance of peace in its quiet flow. But tonight, it felt different. The river, its dark surface reflecting the city's lights, seemed colder, more distant. There was no comfort to be found here, no solace in the rhythmic movement of the water. It felt as though everything, even the river, had turned its back on her. Jiwon sat down on a bench by the water, her coat wrapped tightly around her as if it could shield her from the cold, both physical and emotional. The air was thick with the scent of the city, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her, trying to block out the memories that continued to haunt her. It had been so long since she had last seen him, but it felt as though no time had passed at all. The love they had shared had been strong, unwavering, a connection that had seemed unbreakable. But somewhere along the way, it had faltered. Words had gone unsaid, promises had been forgotten, and in the silence that followed, the love they had once shared had withered, slowly but surely, until it was nothing more than a faded image, a photograph that had lost its color. The truth was undeniable now. He had moved on. He had found a life that no longer included her, a future that had no room for the love they had once shared. And she? She had spent years clinging to a memory, refusing to accept that some things were never meant to be. Her fingers moved to her pocket, and without thinking, she pulled out the crumpled letter she had kept for so long. The ink had faded, the edges were worn, but the words remained. "I will always wait for you." The promise, the hope, the love that had once seemed eternal. But now, as she read those words again, she realized how much they had lost their meaning. Time had erased the promise, just as it had erased them. He had waited, but so had she, and in the end, it hadn't been enough. Jiwon folded the letter carefully and placed it back into her pocket. There was no point in holding on to something that no longer existed. The past had been left behind, and she had to let go. She couldn't keep waiting for something that wasn't coming. The river, flowing quietly before her, was a constant reminder of how life moved on, regardless of whether you were ready or not. As the evening darkened and the city lights flickered to life, Jiwon stood up from the bench. Her heart was heavy, burdened by the weight of everything she had tried to ignore for so long. There was no grand resolution, no moment of clarity that would change everything. There was only the quiet acceptance that some things were beyond her control, beyond her reach. She could never go back to what had been, and the future was a road she had yet to find the courage to walk. Jiwon made her way back to her apartment, the weight of her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The world around her seemed so far away, so distant. When she returned to her apartment, she didn't look at the letters, nor did she try to make sense of the emotions that swirled inside her. She simply sat in the silence of her apartment, the shadows of the past settling around her. The finality of it all was overwhelming, and yet, in some strange way, it was also freeing. She could not change what had happened, and she could not undo the mistakes of the past. All she could do was move forward, but the road ahead seemed impossibly long, and she didn't know if she had the strength to walk it alone. The past had shaped her, but it was time to let it go, no matter how painful. And so, she sat in the quiet, the city's hum fading in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to grieve. For the love that was lost, for the life that could never be, and for the unspoken goodbyes that lingered in the spaces between the past and the present.